So our next lecture is about the Lebanese Civil War, but in order to fully understand the various factors that led up to that conflict, we really need to go back to some degree, even a bit further than the outcome of the First World War when the state of Greater Lebanon was created. So here we have a modern map, and recalling that both Syria and Lebanon had been part of the Ottoman Empire, Lebanon generally being perceived as granted a distinct region of Syria, but nonetheless part of Syria. But I mean, we shouldn't underestimate that sense of distinctiveness, something particularly felt by the Christian Maronite population there. And so here you see a modern day map of Lebanon. Now, if we're talking about the Maronites, as far as this idea that there's kind of a distinct region of Lebanon, it really centered around Mount Lebanon, which would have been kind of in the center, slightly northwest part of the country, where Maronites were very dominant, very much centering around this one particular mountain. But there are other divisions too within the territory that would eventually become the state of Lebanon, which we're going to look at. Sunnis tended to be much more urban based along the coastline, in some ways actually having more in common with the Maronites and other Christian groups in the sense of being urban based to some degree, particularly as this 19th century wore on, becoming more active in trade and so forth. Though there's a large peasant population with the Maronites. And then you have the Shiites, who are predominantly peasants occupying areas in the south and in the northeast, in that area that you see marked as Baalbek. And then you had other populations, definitely other Christian populations, and the Druze, D-R-U-Z-E, which are going to play a pretty prominent role in Lebanon, often perceived historically as a kind of Muslim heretical sect, a very mysterious one, wherein it's very hard to ascertain exactly what their beliefs are. There's a likelihood that they're somehow connected with the Fatimid dynasty that had been based in Egypt. There had been the promotion of the idea that one of the Fatimid caliphs was somehow the incarnation of God. That might be at least one basis of the Druze religion. But really, probably the most important thing is that by the time we get to the 19th century, in many ways seeing themselves as a distinct people, almost as if they constituted an ethnicity, even if they spoke Arabic and culturally very similar to other Arabs. The reason many of them being based in Lebanon is a mountainous area, and if you're a persecuted minority, this would have been a good place to set up shop. It's kind of easier to defend yourself, harder for the central government to harass and to find. And in fact, they become quite famous for their very capabilities in militarily, seen as kind of very ferocious warriors, people you don't want to get on the wrong side of. Now, you might remember that during the First World War, you had this Arab revolt, which eventually occupied Damascus and had then sought to set up a provisional Arab government under Faisal Hussein, who would also represent Arab interests at the Paris Peace Conference, ultimately was unable to ascertain British support for an independent Arab state. The British, at some point, more concerned with appeasing their French allies. And so eventually the British withdrew militarily from Syria, allowing the French to come in and drive Faisal Hussein out. And one of the first things they did was to actually create a Lebanese state, in large part based on not just the idea that somehow the Maronite Christians were a distinct people, but also because they had very strong ties historically with the French. They were generally considered to be Catholic, even if maintaining many of their own beliefs and actual practices. Rites is the term we often use for practices in the church. They did, however, recognize the authority of the Pope, and this was part of the basis of their strong connections with Europe, and in particular France. And so, for instance, many Maronites would send their children during the 19th century to French missionary schools. They felt a strong, not just political, but also cultural affiliation with the French, many of them speaking French and so forth. And in fact, even today, French is a very commonly spoken language in Lebanon. And again, they were concentrated primarily around the area of Mount Lebanon, which beginning in 1861, so this was during the Ottoman period, had actually become a semi-autonomous political unit, or mutasarrifate, a kind of governorship, run by a Christian mutasarrif or governor. And this was actually created in large part due to European pressure after there had been a rather sizable massacre of Maronites, primarily at the hands of Druzes. And it really wasn't about religion. It probably had more to do with kind of socioeconomic factors. Many of the Druzes involved were landlords, many of the Maronites peasants. So in some ways, had kind of the appearance of a peasant uprising against proper authority. But in any event, after the massacre, which did spill over into Damascus and ended up targeting other Christians, and there it really did become a little bit more about religion, the European powers used this as a pretext to put pressure on the Ottoman Empire to give the area of Mount Lebanon a kind of semi-autonomous status, one which the French in particular would act as a kind of guarantor to ensure that they pretty much were managing their own affairs. So this is kind of setting up this idea that the Maronites constitute a distinct people, in a sense, kind of prefiguring what would happen after the war with the creation of a Lebanese state. And as you might remember from our earlier discussion, the problem ultimately ended up being that whereas the Mutasarrifate was relatively small and really did correspond to areas where the Maronites were predominant, the newly created Lebanese state, and this happened on September 1st, 1920, would include a lot of territory that was in fact not predominantly Maronite. The idea being that it really wouldn't be a viable state if it didn't include the hinterland, particularly kind of agricultural regions, but that meant that you now drew in large numbers of Sunni and in particular Shiite Muslims who did not want to be part of a Maronite-dominated state. And we've already seen this map, but to kind of remind us of the various divisions that existed there, right? So the French kind of formalized this newly created Lebanese state in September 1st, 1926, when they declared it a Lebanese Republic, which, is still basically under the authority of France, but, kind of constituting a no turning back moment, shall we say. And the French really were kind of counting on the idea that the Maronites, given that they were a majority, or at least the biggest single religious group as of the 1932 census, but hardly constituted an absolute majority, and definitely, this kind of feeling that they would be dependent on French support in order to ensure that they were able to survive, that they wouldn't be persecuted in the state, and in fact that the state would survive. You might recall that during the Second World War, the French were much surprised to learn that pretty much all Lebanese, including Maronites, wanted them out. So on November 8th, 1943, the Lebanese government had unilaterally abolished the mandate. And you might recall the French resisted, but then international pressure eventually forced the French to withdraw, and you ended up now with a Lebanese state, independent, consisting of several religious groups. Right, so the map there is kind of color-coded, and hopefully you're able to see this on whatever device you're looking at. So kind of the tan areas the light tan areas being predominantly Maronite, the kind of pink areas being where you have the dark pink would be sizable Shiite populations, and so forth, the kind of dark brown being where you have Maronites. So notice some areas are kind of mixed, and so on, right? So it's really quite a mosaic of different religious groups, and you can imagine that if you're trying to create some kind of unified state out of this, and if these various religious groups are not able to get along, this is really going to be a big problem. So again, to remind us regarding Lebanese independence, that during the war, Lebanon had been under the control of Vichy France, meaning kind of indirectly under Nazi control. That was a kind of puppet state created out of part of France, the rest of it being occupied. And there were those who were fighting to liberate the French from Nazi control, often referred to as the Free French, and they were also active in Syria and Lebanon with British military support. And again, much to their surprise, when they supposedly, quote unquote, liberated Lebanon from Vichy control, They were quite surprised when the Lebanese government unilaterally abolished the mandate in 1943, to which the French reacted by throwing the new government into prison. And again, international pressure finally forced them to release government officials and accept Lebanese independence. Also, the fact that the French were pretty much broke by the end of the Second World War. So, what happened? Well, representatives of the different religious groups had come together and had actually negotiated an arrangement, an unwritten agreement known as the National Pact, by which they thought they might be able to get along, right? So it basically would be an agreement about how to share power, kind of accepting that each religious group, in a sense, would be distinct and in some ways would constitute the primary identity of individuals, right? One was, first a Maronite, second a Lebanese, right? One was first a Sunni Muslim, second a Lebanese, and so on. So, this is a really interesting experiment. Like, can you have a state where one's primary loyalty and sense of identity is not necessarily to the state itself, right? It's going to be what we call a multi-confessional state. Confessional in this particular instance referring to different religious identities. So some of the key points of the agreement. First of all, with respect to the idea that there is such a thing as Lebanon, the idea that, first of all, the Maronites would accept that ultimately Lebanon is in some sense Arab, right? Even if it wouldn't be part of Syria or of a larger, some kind of larger Arab entity, they accept that in some degree it is affiliated with the other Arab states, related to which the Maronites agree never to seek foreign intervention, right? It's not a Western state, it's not a European affiliated state, it is an Arab state. The Muslims, both Shiites and Sunnis, for their part, agree to give up any aspiration to unite with Syria, the idea that Lebanon will remain a distinct state. And then the rest of the agreement is about how to share power, right? So first of all, the parliament would allocate X number of seats to each religious group based on the 1932 census, meaning Maronites would have the largest number of seats, and then after that Sunni, then Shiite, and so forth. By the way, I think we've already discussed how the Maronites from this point forward will insist that no new census be taken, and that has been a factor up until today. And pretty much everyone understands that the Maronites are no longer the single largest group, so they really didn't want to have a head count that would actually show that. Beyond that, they would actually allocate different offices to different religious groups. The most important office and most powerful, President of the Republic, would always be a Maronite. The Prime Minister, a pretty important position, but the individual chosen to be Prime Minister would be chosen by the President, so it had to be someone acceptable to the Maronites, but that individual would be a Sunni. More properly, the title is President of the Council of Ministers. After that, the President of the National Assembly would always be a Shiite, and then down the line, Deputy Speaker of the Parliament, a Greek Orthodox, and so forth, right? And, for a while, this actually seemed to work. Partly because economically, Lebanon is going to prove pretty successful during the late 1940s and 1950s, particularly the city of Beirut, which is the capital of Lebanon. It proves to be a very, very dynamic entrepreneurial metropolis. It's famed for its multicultural and multi-religious character. It's kind of the idea that everyone can get along as long as people are making money. And for a while, Beirut is going to be making money hand over foot. Now, this reflects a number of factors. First of all, Lebanon is going to have a very kind of laissez-faire attitude about economics, the idea that the government really shouldn't involve itself in economic activity. So pretty much people are allowed to do what they want, to the extent even bordering on almost kind of corrupt, semi-illegal behavior. And part of this does reflect the multi-confessional nature of the government. It's very difficult for it to actually involve itself in the activities of Sunni Muslims or Maronite Christians and so forth, because it would often be perceived as a government interfering in contravention of the basic premise of the National Pact. Now, the other factor is, and we've kind of touched on it, but during the 1950s, many other states, beginning with Egypt, are going to have kind of much more socialistic economic policies where the government is much more active. So you're going to have like Arab entrepreneurs in other parts of the Middle East are more than happy to keep their money in Beirut, either in Beirut banks, which very often it becomes kind of known as the Switzerland of the Middle East, right? Where you have these very powerful secrecy laws, don't ask, don't tell. People aren't asking where you got your money from and so forth. There's not much in the way of investigation. The whole currency exchange is highly deregulated. So there's kind of a lot of stuff going on under the table. Arab entrepreneurs in other parts of the Middle East more than happy to either keep their money in banks in Beirut or to invest their money in economic activity in Beirut. Trade restrictions are removed as well, so there's a lot of import-export trade going on. So a lot of money being made. But ultimately, probably the two groups benefiting the most are going to be Maronites, other Christians as well to some degree, but also Sunni Muslims. The one group that's not benefiting from this are Shiites, who tend to be, again, much more, kind of peasant backgrounds, more agriculturally based, residing more in villages. Very little of the money being generated in Beirut is making its way to the countryside. There's not much going on in terms of development of infrastructure or schooling or anything that might help regions like the Bekaa Valley, for instance, to properly develop. So that's going to create some resentment, and particularly as Shiites become to some degree more educated, more politicized, that's going to become a major factor. Now, in some ways, really more important than anyone elected to office are what are known as political bosses, individuals belonging to powerful families that represent the interests of particular religious groups or even particular factions within, say, the Maronite community or the Sunni community and so forth. Individuals known as zaims or Zulma, I mean, he literally means leader, but in this case, you might think of it more as a kind of mafioso boss. So these individuals, very often, to some degree, operating through the central government, but ensuring that the government works on behalf of their specific interests. And so very often, things operate not in connection with formal institutions of government, but more through individual connections. It's more about who you know than going through the proper channels. There's a lot of bribery going on. The manipulation of elections to ensure that individuals representative of the zaims or of family interests are the ones who are in office. So ultimately, everyone is actually promoting their own individual religious or family interests. There's really hardly anyone in the national government who is primarily working on behalf of all Lebanese or on behalf of national interests. So in this respect, the whole Zaim system very detrimental to kind of more development, normal development of democracy, where you have different political parties that represent different ideologies, and then people would vote for those parties that they feel that they ideologically align with, that these parties are going to, on the basis of their ideology, promote the interests of all Lebanese and so forth. That doesn't mean you don't have parties, right? Probably one of the most important parties early on will be the Kataib Social Democratic Party. Kataib is an Arabic term meaning brigade. Brigades is actually plural, sorry. More commonly known in English as the Phalange. They're essentially a right-wing Lebanese political party primarily concerned with promoting Maronite interests and to some degree the interests of particular Maronite families. So they're officially secular. Right? This has nothing to do with Maronite religious beliefs or somehow kind of anti-Islamic, right? It really is more in the vein of kind of like the way mafia families in Sicily at one point would be promoting the interests of their own families or communities directly tied to them. The Phalange actually started out as a youth movement initiated by a fellow named Pierre Gemayel. So Gemayel, one of the more important families within the Maronite community. And that started in 1936, and eventually it evolves into a proper political party, but again, primarily representative of Maronite interests. Now, from an early point, there is in fact one political party that is actively promoting the interests of all Lebanese. It has an ideological basis known as the Progressive Socialist Party. It is headed up by a Druze named Kamal Jumblat. And so he's like someone who's, so we do have some individuals such as him who are actively promoting the idea of, trying to forge a unified Lebanese identity, to have a party that does represent a particular ideological approach, but one aiming to serve the interests of all Lebanese. And in fact, later during the early years of the Lebanese Civil War, it will become a major factor among anti-government forces. So as I mentioned, for a while, this kind of multi-confessional arrangement does seem to be working. You have the first two presidents, Bashar el-Khoury and Camille Chamoun, both Maronites, obviously. And on the surface, things seem to be working, but from the very beginning, you kind of recognize that you're kind of seeing the seeds being planted for the problems that will later bring about the Lebanese Civil War. So the first president, Bashar el-Khoury, had actually been a nationalist hero during the French Mandatory period, and that was the basis of his being elected the first president in 1943. He was actually a major figure in drawing up the National Pact, which would form the country's constitutional structure. But eventually he's going to seek to cling to power. Right, so one of the stipulations regarding the office of president is that they could only serve one term. And so when his term is coming to an end, he's actually going to try and manipulate parliamentary elections so that certain individuals might get into office, and then they might revise the stipulation regarding term limitations so that he might serve a second term. And this actually leads to massive demonstrations against a kind of perceived corruption in this vein, and he's forced to resign on September 18th, 1952. Now, the one positive thing you can say about it, it's perhaps, reflects a positive development that you did have people demonstrating against this. And some of them were Maronite. I mean, the people who were opposed to this, it didn't break down strictly along religious lines. So, it does seem that maybe, kind of on the ground, something resembling a Lebanese identity is starting to take shape, one inclusive of different religious groups, and we might consider the fact that Lebanon still exists. So maybe something is happening in that vein. The next president, Camille Chamoun, also proves to be somewhat corrupt in this vein, but he is confronted with a real crisis, right? So he's president from 1952 to 1958. And he too will try to extend his time in office. But he is president at a time when Nasser is growing in stature and Pan-Arabism is rising throughout the Middle East. And so particularly many Sunni Muslims in Lebanon, apart from whatever had been promised in the National Pact, but they're really being drawn to this movement of Pan-Arabism. And of course, in theory, it had been agreed that that Sunni Muslims would never promote the idea that Lebanon should be part of a pan-Arab state. But as you might imagine, the more powerful Nasser is becoming, and the more influential is becoming more and more seductive to go down this route. I should note too, it's not strictly a division between Sunni Muslims and, say, Maronite Christians. There are some Sunni Muslims who do not necessarily support Pan-Arabism. There are some Maronites who do. Certainly many non-Maronite Christians do. They don't really associate themselves with the Maronites on the basis of religion. So divisions don't necessarily fall strictly along religious lines. But in a general sense, you could say that the strongest advocates for Pan-Arabism and that Lebanon should be a part of this is the Sunni Muslim community. At least one demand that they have right from the start is that a new census should be taken. There's kind of a recognition that from a pretty early point the demographics are changing, and they want to make sure that the division of power should represent more accurately the different components. And there's kind of a sense that probably Sunni Muslims have now surpassed Maronites in terms of numbers. So, by the way, Camille Chamoun later on is going to be one of the country's main Christian leaders during the Lebanese Civil War 2 decades later. So he is, squarely representing primarily Maronite interests as president. So things come to a head in 1958. Largely because of developments in the rest of the Middle East, right? So increasingly, Sunni Muslims in particular are really kind of promoting the idea that Lebanon should be playing a much more active role with respect to Pan-Arabism. This is threatening the potential of a civil war between them and Maronite Christians. And things really come to a head when Shamoun attempts to enact measures that would allow him to take a second term. Things go from bad to worse after the Suez Crisis, right? At that point, particularly among many Sunni Muslims, there's kind of an expectation that Lebanon should express its disgust with what Britain and France had done, having sided with Israel and attacked Egypt by breaking diplomatic relations with the European powers. This is something, including the United States, I should say, and this is something Shamoun refuses to do. In fact, rather than doing that, he's actually going to strengthen ties with the pro-Western states in the Middle East via the Baghdad Pact. You might recall that the Baghdad Pact, well, we discussed it previously and it's discussed in some of the readings you've had, was a kind of anti-communist alliance primarily initiated by the United States but then dominated by Great Britain that involved Iraq, and it was centered in Baghdad. And at this point, Iraq is still a kind of pro-Western government, or has a pro-Western government, but also involving Turkey, Iran, and Pakistan. And it would seem Lebanon, right? And so this is just going to further aggravate the situation. And then things really come completely to a head with the creation of the United Arab Republic, right? The union between Egypt and Syria. Just imagine that you're a Lebanese, particularly Sunni Muslim, though some Shiites who are now becoming more politically aware also following suit, right? But I mean, this would have just felt like, wow, this whole kind of dream of a united Pan-Arab state is really beginning to pick up momentum. We want to be a part of that, right? So there's incredible pressure coming from Muslims for the Lebanese government to join the newly created United Arab Republic. On the other hand, this is something incredibly resisted to by Maronite Christians who want to keep Lebanon independent and ideally aligned with the Western powers because they're really beginning to feel threatened by Nasser. And then comes the toppling of Iraq's pro-Western government, at which point President Shamoun decides that he cannot wait any longer. He needs to be more proactive. And he calls for American assistance to prevent the country from falling to pro-Nasser forces. And this leads to the American intervention known as Operation Blue Bat, which, among other things, kind of marks perhaps a turning point in terms of American involvement in the Middle East. I mean, you might recall during the Suez Crisis, the United States had not only not been militarily involved, but had actually put pressure on the British, French, and Israelis to withdraw from the Suez Canal zone. So this is kind of the first time that American military forces are operating on the ground, and notably in a way that is going to be viewed very unfavorably by the majority of Arabs in the Middle East. I mean, in support of a very unpopular political figure. But it does reestablish order. But we should also note, too, and the president at the time is President Eisenhower, and to his credit, he kind of recognizes that whatever happens next, Shamoun has to go. I mean, he is just a hugely unpopular figure, and so he's going to be replaced to some degree at the behest of the United States by a fellow named Fuad Shahab. And so he's someone seen as acceptable by all the different religious groups to some extent based on how he had behaved in the period leading up to Operation Blue Bat. At some point, Shamoun had called upon him as commander of the army to militarily intervene to suppress demonstrations, and he refused to do this. So first of all, I mean, I think he genuinely felt that it was just not appropriate for the army to be used in this way against its own people. But given that the army was made up of soldiers coming from all the different religious groups, it might also have just been a realistic assessment that this might have actually brought about civil war right there and then. You can imagine that a lot of Sunni Muslims in the army would have been very reluctant to be involved in suppressing demonstrations predominantly headed by Sunni Muslims and so forth. So he is a Maronite, but he's seen as someone moderate and thus acceptable to Sunni Muslims for the post of president. And he's pretty smart. He kind of understands that he's going to have to do something in order to bring Lebanese of the different religious communities together. So he's going to launch a very ambitious program of political and economic reform, seeking to modernize the state, but also to strengthen the central government at the expense of political bosses. That it should really not just simply be a tool of the political bosses, but should somehow be promoting the interests of all Lebanese, regardless of what their religious background might be. It's kind of also recognition that some groups within Lebanon had not been benefiting from all the very kind of strong economic developments in Lebanon until then, for instance, particularly Shiites. So he's going to, for one thing, install a social welfare system. But again, the basic idea is trying to promote a Lebanese government representing all Lebanese. And some of this will be initially successful, but obviously we know this is going to end up in a civil war, so something clearly went wrong. And we'll pick up that story with part two of this lecture.